Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Reigniting Small Business. I'm Laura Richards, COO of Spark Business Institute, and we're doing things a little differently today. As you can see, I'm here at home and Patrick is at the office. And so we're going to have a discussion around the inhibition of change. So Patrick, how are you doing over there?
Doing good. This is different. I'm kind of looking forward to it.
Yes, having the graphic aids. I always like to see you up by a whiteboard. So we got to face it. The last year has caused almost every industry and business we know to experience change, whether it was change that they embraced and embarked on proactively, or whether they were kind of cowering in the corner and hoping this thing is going to pass. But it doesn't look like it's going to go back to normal really ever, and not the same. It's never going to go back the same. So, what we wanted to look at today is how some folks really embrace this opportunity to transform, and some qualities of the leadership of those organizations who do that, and as well as the ones who haven't, and maybe how they can work on embracing change proactively.
What we're really talking about is innovation, right? And let's take a look at this chart here because innovation, and we'll write that right up here. Okay, innovation requires two very different abilities on one axis, and the other is your creativity on the other axis. And so what ends up happening is this. Folks who are able to be very creative, but also willing to take the risk of change, what that change is going to bring and what the possible downside to that is, they become innovators, right? The more risk you're willing to take, the more creativity you have, the more innovation is possible. So what we end up seeing is how business owners react. You know, those folks who sort of hunkered down and just tried to wait for this to pass because there's a fear there, right? I don't know what this is. I don't know what to do. I just got to hope this goes away. Low tolerance for risk, at least risk that required change. I mean, you could say there is a risk in doing that, right? There's a risk of just sitting still. But that is not viewed the same way as doing something, right? And then there's not a lot of creativity there. I have no control over this. There's nothing I can do. I'm just going to sit still, right? So that place there is where a lot of people ended up. But let's talk about those owners who did some form of moving towards the innovation side of this, right? So I think we have a few examples out there. One company we should look at is Covington Alsina. Covington Alsina is a financial planning firm. I've worked with the owner for many years. Her name's Ann Alsina. And what Ann found when the pandemic struck was that she had been booming. Her business was booming. She was bringing in lots of new clients. Things were going really well. So when she looked at this situation, she's like, I can't let this pandemic stop what I've been creating here. So she innovated, but she didn't innovate to change her services, how they were delivered, anything like that. What she did is she said, okay, here are the new circumstances that I am presented with, and I need to create some way in which I can convince my customers and my staff and be safe, that we can continue to do this. So her innovation looked like, okay, this is a deadly pandemic. People are scared of getting infected. We are going to provide an environment where the chances of that are almost non-existent. So we are going to have hand sanitizer with our logo on it that's going to be throughout the office, little baskets of hand sanitizer. So any client there who just feels uncomfortable at any given moment can reach over, grab a hand sanitizer, sanitize their hands. Staff can do the same thing. There's never a spot in the office where there wasn't a little basket of hand sanitizer immediately available. And they had a bunch of free masks. If you showed up and for some reason you weren't comfortable, your mask was dirty, or you were just uncomfortable, or whatever, you could get a free mask. If you forgot your mask, oh no, here I am, I forgot my mask. Don't worry, we have some. And they provided face shields. So you have your mask on, you want an extra level of protection, there's a face shield that you can borrow. They were cleaning them, doing everything to sanitize, but here you go, use it while you're here, okay? In addition, she had installed in her heating ducts and her heating system infrared devices that killed 99.9% of all microbes, okay? So all the air circulating throughout her office complex was being put through what was basically a sanitization process. And in all of the main conference rooms, she had ionization devices that were designed to attract and capture particles that were moving through the air and remove them from that sort of distribution throughout the room. So she went to all the possible ends to make the environment feel like it's okay for us to be here as a client and for staff to be here because Anne's taking care of us.
And what I love about that, Patrick, is that's so on message for her brand. One of the things as being a financial planner, you want people to feel safe, comfortable, and in good hands. And literally, she was doing all of those things physically and visually for her folks to see that were coming into the office. Not only did she do that, Patrick, but I know that all of her clients received in the mail a Covington Alsina mask with her wallpaper pattern on it.
Yep.
So she's very thought out and very on message.
And I think that's absolutely on message. But let's take a look at where that actually puts her on this entire innovation scale. So what we basically saw there was we saw a moderate level of creativity, right? This wasn't crazy out of the box, but it was way beyond what a lot of folks had the opportunity to do and didn't think of doing, right? And it wasn't super risky. There's a little bit of risk. I mean, by showing, there's cost there, and also by showing, all this stuff so prevalently, there's also the worry that you overemphasize COVID, and people are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm even here. Look at all this safety equipment. I should be home, right? So there's a bit of risk there. But in the big scheme of things, creativity is moderate, risk is moderate. So Anne's dot for innovation is here. She's moved from status quo, but she hasn't gone this far up. Now, that doesn't mean she couldn't, but she didn't see a need to. Her innovation fit into this distribution well, and it has been successful for her. So let's look at another client. This is a client I've worked with over the years also. It's Awards Plus. They are a company that provides awards and trinkets and stuff for conferences, what it sounds like, awards basically. And one of the partners there, his name is Wayne McCrory, and when this whole pandemic thing happened, initially Wayne was hopeful that this wasn't going to affect his business. But when he realized that the pandemic was shutting down conferences and making all those events where awards are distributed, and even, think about sports, and all the sports had stopped. So any kind of awards that went along with that sort of thing didn't need to be produced. So he realized very quickly, people don't need what I'm making right now. So one of the things that he recognized was, but all of a sudden there's a new market here, right? We have a market for PPE products, right? We need safety products for people to weather this storm and be safe from the pandemic. So he looked at the idea of creating PPE products, face shields specifically. And what he realized was, okay, there's a lot of grants, there's a lot of support out there for businesses to make a shift to helping us deal with the situation at hand. So he went ahead and he pulled the trigger on flipping his production to making face shields, providing them to hospitals, selling them to different groups that were distributing that type of product. And he made that shift. And in doing so, he also then took advantage of the support and the opportunities for funding that existed provided by the government to try to encourage this sort of thing. So he did receive grants. He did receive funding to help make that happen. So when we look at that, we go, wow, that was pretty interesting. And if I'm going to map it here, what I would say is this. Okay, moderate creativity, right? Because everyone's talking about this. We need to make PPE products. If you can switch your production to make this stuff happen, it'd be helpful if you did, right? So there's a moderate amount of creativity in this, but there's a fair amount of risk, okay? Because there's no guarantee you're getting any of those grants. There's no guarantee that they're going to sell. This can be a risky proposition. So Wayne went ahead and made that move, and it was a successful move. They moved thousands of pieces of PPE face masks to various places, both locally and regionally, and provided a way for their workers to continue to be employed and produce something. Now, it didn't turn into a large moneymaker, but it kept operations going and allowed the company to pivot while they waited to see where this was going to go. So when we look at that, we see a bit more risk here. It's about the same creativity as Anne, but accomplishing the same sort of thing. Let's keep the continuity of the business going.
And you had another example, Patrick, which we had featured on another one of our episodes of innovation, pandemic innovation from small businesses, which was Vita Taco.
Yeah, and Vita Taco I think is a fun one, because this is one where there's a ton of creativity and there's a ton of risk involved. So we're up here in that innovation category very dramatically. And so what they did is they got super creative in multiple ways. First thing they did is they took a food truck and they converted it into a delivery system for neighborhoods. So what they would do is they would go into a neighborhood, they would announce that they were coming. They would have pre-prepared meals and pre-prepared mixed drinks. You were allowed in that neighborhood, once you knew it was coming, to call into them, place an order. So they would show up with the truck, you'd go out to the truck, they would hand you what you ordered. But they also took enough stuff with them so that there was a little bit of, people might drive by and go, hey, look, the Vita Taco truck, I really want a margarita. And wander up, and by golly, yes, we still have a couple margaritas left. Here you go. So it was a very innovative way to take food out, promote their brand. Don't think that anybody seeing that truck in their neighborhood didn't remember Vita Taco. So they're not just dealing with the situation now, they're innovating to the future. Our brand has now just had a whole bunch of cachet added to it, right? Other things they did was they took the restaurant itself and they had big roll-up windows. And what they did is they threw those things open and they created an outdoor almost market where people could come up and they could hand stuff out. And they didn't just hand out food, like pre-prepared meals. They actually had pickup for vegetables and produce and all. So people could place an order, show up, and be handed their allotment of vegetables for their grocery run that week. So they pivoted entirely. Now they're not just making food and serving people, they're providing the ingredients for the food. Okay, that's highly innovative. That is thinking out of the box.
Okay, Patrick. So one of the things I'm curious about is, once a company starts by being innovative, do they create a culture where innovation continues to happen over and over again?
Well, that is the best type of company if you think about it. If you're already innovative and adaptive throughout the entire lifetime of the company, that company has the ability to adjust to markets. It has the ability to be a long-lived company because it's going to figure out what is needed and deliver that. So let's take a look at a company like 3M. So 3M started out as a mining company, and then it became a provider of ergonomic office supplies. And one of the most famous of those supplies that sort of generated a whole host of different products from 3M was the Post-it note. And so they started with the Post-it note, and then there became multiple different adaptations around the Post-it note, from colors to stickiness to how it was used to the size of it, and led to a variety of things. So 3M, from the very beginning of what they were to what they are now, shows massive innovation. But even within, on the individual products, you show how they continue to perfect the initial innovation that they did, and that adaptation allowed for a host of new products, allowed for them to continually stay relevant as they went along.
So, Patrick, when you think about people that fall high on your matrix, the matrix behind you, I think about big business leaders that have taken a ton of risk and that are super creative, like Elon Musk, Richard Branson, or Jeff Bezos. But where do most of us fall?
So let's talk about those folks first and give you this little quadrant up here, the true innovator quadrant. High risk, high creativity. 4% of the population falls into that area. Okay? Now, right here, 60% of the population falls in here. And if you extend this way, you get about 71% of the population. So you can see that innovation can be very, very difficult for most people to go to naturally. It doesn't mean that they can't learn it, doesn't mean that they can't make it happen, but most folks, a majority of the population, live in a non-innovative quadrant here. And if you go with risk as your main innovator there, you've got a full 2/3 almost do not possess the ability to innovate at that level. So that is definitely something that comes into play when we look at how all these businesses have reacted during this pandemic.
Well, what's interesting too, Patrick, is we have those names of those successful companies because they were successful. But as you mentioned, those high risk takers have a lot of crash and burns as well.
Yes, and having done a little bit of that myself, I will attest to the fact that sometimes this whole piece can look a little bit different. Like, for instance, down here is the dreamer, right? An idea a minute, but never any action on it. And up over here, you end up with folks that we would term as reckless, right? A lot of bankruptcies happening because of this, right? These people at least stayed safe. They could dream all they want and nothing occurred to them. These folks, well, sometimes things don't end up the way you want it to.
Well, thank you for clarifying that for me. I did have that question. But outside of these qualities that we're talking about for founders and leaders who innovate, what other things can affect our business's ability to undertake change?
All right, so let's talk about what happens with change and why change can be very difficult and why it doesn't frequently happen even with intention of it happening. So let's look at a typical situation with a business. What you have is you have management. Okay. This is management. And what this shows is a manager gets in place, things happen around that manager gets more efficient, they learn new things, they're given support of technology or other people to help or whatever, and so there's a natural curve here. Management starts, and then it slowly begins to trend upward of what management's abilities are to handle whatever it is that's going on, okay, to manage it. Now, what we see frequently with change is this. Change brings in a level of complexity that creates challenges for management. And the way this typically looks is that change starts and it parallels management. So management is able to handle the change initially. But then, as things become more complex, so this is the complexity piece. As things become more complex, complexity is a exponential thing. As something becomes more complex, then the stuff next to it's more complex, and it just blooms like this. Whereas management is much more linear. We add this piece of support, we learn this particular new skill, we have a different system. It's very linear. So complexity does this. Okay, it has that hockey stick piece. So we got complexity versus management curves, and you can see right where things start to get dicey with change. It's right in here. And so what we call this is the knowing-doing gap. And what that gap. All right, what this means is that there is a gap between what people know, they don't know what this is, and their willingness to do it anyway. How do you keep doing something that has become so complex that you don't quite understand it? People tend to freeze. They don't just lean in to that change and I'm going to learn it as I go, or I'll understand this and adapt as these things come at me. We're just going to keep moving. They stop dead and they go, wait a minute, I don't know enough to continue doing. And so change halts. Now let's look at another piece of this. This is a piece that looks sort of like this. This right here is a change curve. And what this shows is that we start doing some change, and over time, a little bit of change happens, and if we're lucky, we're moving along this path, and some change is occurring. So what we have is what we call innovation trajectory. And an innovation trajectory does this sort of the same thing as what you see over here. it goes along with the change, and then all of a sudden, innovations start to happen a lot. Innovation leads to innovation. It's the same concept that you have in brainstorming, right? One idea builds on another, opportunity presents itself because of an innovation that you've already done, and so innovation starts to bubble up. And what ends up happening there is that does a hockey stick, but the change curve and the willingness to adapt and actually make changes over and over again begins to become a problem. So the gap that we end up with here is the understanding as a prerequisite for change. The problem with this is there isn't any way for this to actually happen. The understanding as a prerequisite dooms change because so much change, so much innovation is starting to occur as this happens that for everybody to stop and pause and learn every single one of those changes and be comfortable with it to move is only going at this level, whereas the opportunities are going at this level. So this is that thing that a lot of folks have probably heard where, you come up to the cliff and you see that chasm and you don't see the steps. And when you're talking to all those motivational folks and those leadership folks, and they're always saying, you have to be brave enough to step out over the cliff and trust that there's going to be a step there. And you've seen all those illustrations where you see the person walking where there's nothing there, and then when their foot hits, all of a sudden there's a platform. And so they're walking across the big chasm with these invisible steps appearing as they go. That is actually an excellent description of what getting past this really means. You can't always know how it's going to turn out, what the next step is. I'm going to get comfortable with that change. Sometimes change just starts rolling, and when it starts rolling, it overwhelms people's ability to understand exactly what they're dealing with. They just have to go with it. That can be very difficult to manage. Hence, management curve, change curve, and then these hockey sticks. If we can address these gaps, the knowing-doing gap, and the understanding as a prerequisite for change, innovation can happen.
So, Patrick, how do we address this knowing-doing gap, the understanding is a prerequisite for change? How do we address it?
That's a great question, and if it was easy to address, a lot of change would happen a lot more and a lot easier than it does now. I mean, change management is one of the toughest things to do well, and innovation within a business is extremely difficult. So here's some of the tools that we typically try to use to overcome these two gaps. The first, I would say, is the one that at SBI we really kind of adhere to. This is one that we believe is probably the most powerful one, and that's called momentum. And we look at momentum as almost an additional resource for a business to utilize. So when you go into a business, typically you find a situation where money might be very tight, everybody's working overtime, so both of those resources, which are the standard resources that you have to pull from, right? Capital and manpower, right? And they're already pretty much used up in a lot of these businesses we work with. So we have to create another resource. And a lot of times you'll see folks go in and what they'll do is they'll say, okay, you need to take a risk and hire somebody to create more time, right? Or you need to go and try to get debt finance to create more capital. Well, in cases where neither of those things are easily done or possible to be done, a third currency is very nice to have. And so we've laid out momentum as that currency. And how this works is the same concept as you would expect of the idea of when that snowball starts to roll down a hill, right? It can't stop it from rolling. It's rolling. And as it's rolling, it's accumulating and getting bigger and bigger. That vision is our vision of how momentum works. Some successes, whether it's in marketing, whether it's in efficiencies, whatever successes begin to happen within an organization or business begins to build on itself, right? Because now all of a sudden, oh wow, we can. And oh wow, that worked. And oh wow, we're making progress. And then there's excitement. Now we've got a little bit more oomph in our step. Some time is being generated because people are willing to work more or because the efficiencies have taken hold. And now all of a sudden there's more clients, so now money's coming. So by creating that currency of momentum and it working, the other currencies start to go up too. And the next thing you know, you've got this launch of change, innovation, possibility.
When you're in a company that is doing that and has that kind of leadership, Patrick, it is so exciting. One of my early jobs in my career was working at Discovery Communications, and John Hendricks, who was the founder of Discovery, University of Maryland grad, so passionate about documentary and nature. I just felt like when I was working there, I was a cog in a much bigger wheel. Everybody was working to achieve the same ends. And because of that, there was this feeling of inclusion from the very lowest levels of employees all the way up to the vice presidents of departments. It was a small enough company that communication was actually really wide open. And this was way back in the 1990s. But I know what it feels like when you're working with a leader who can communicate their vision and who is taking action, 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 and everything is leading to something. And when that momentum feels like it's just basically pushing you through things, it's practically palpable that everything is moving in the same direction. So that feels extremely different than when you're working under a leader who isn't taking action and creating momentum. We all know what it feels like to be in those other types of kind of stifled and not thriving businesses.
So a couple of the skills that we associate with leaders creating momentum are the ability to be driven and the ability to initiate. Those two skills, if a leader possesses them, the ability to generate momentum is a much easier thing to accomplish.
Well, Patrick, we've talked a little bit about a few of the things that hold people back from being change agents, and I know we've got a couple more to talk about. One of those biggest I think we come up against is the terror barrier.
And this is something that we've taken from Bob Proctor. Any of you who've seen Bob Proctor knows he talks about this a lot. And it's the idea that we're not going to do something because it's too risky and therefore our fear levels are too high to allow us to do it. We can intellectually think about it, right? We can contemplate it. We can come up with arguments around it. But when it comes time to actually act, it's hard to do because it just doesn't feel comfortable, right? And he calls it the terror barrier, and I borrowed it here because I think it's a very apt description of what you face. But what really happens with this is this. You've done all the analysis you need to do. You've done it. I mean, you've checked everything. You've looked at it twice. You've brought in data. You've got other opinions. You've brainstormed around it. You've built a plan. You've done all the analysis and thought required for you to move something forward. But when it comes time to actually take that step off that cliff, over that chasm, and think there's going to be a landing step for you there, you can't do it. Because you keep looking there and you keep going, but I don't see it. The terror barrier piece is going through it anyway. Now, Bob Proctor has a whole thing that he does of coaching folks in their mindset and how they do this. And that's not what I'm here to talk about, and it's his material, not mine. But what I would say is this. Sometimes when that happens, you need the boot to just kick you off the cliff. Hey, we've analyzed this so much, we know there's a step there. You just can't see it or feel it yet. So you just need the boot. And sometimes that is, the role of maybe a consultant or maybe an advisory board. Or maybe that's you turning off your brain for a minute and just plunging ahead. Because once the bucket tips over, then everything happens. And so it's the tipping over. It's almost that concept of getting in the pool, right? You put your toe in, you look, you put your toe in, you look. If somebody just pushes you in, you're in. And now you're going to have to deal with that. Oh, it's cold. Wait, I don't know how to swim. Whatever it is you have to deal with, it just happens. And so that terror barrier piece is an acknowledgement. There's fear. We need to be worried about this. Yes, there's risk involved, but we've done everything possible to analyze and make this as reasonable of a plan as possible, and we just need to step.
So, Patrick, take us through what it looks like if you decide you're going to innovate. What do we need to do to make it happen? What are the steps?
So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to come up with your plausible idea or your initiative. So you've got that concept. You're then going to check your internal systems. Are you even capable of this fitting in somewhere? Do you have the equipment and everything necessary to do it? Do you have internal systems to make this innovation actually happen. Then you're going to allocate resources based on the risk reward of that concept. So, if you're missing certain internal systems, do you purchase them? Are you willing to spend how much money to make this happen, or what are you willing to risk based on what that reward looks like? Once you've done that, now it's time for a little bit of market research. Nobody's suggesting that you should go out and just trust that it's going to happen. There's probably a way for you to get market research, whether it's very aggressively or whether it's just polling some clients or some folks to see what that feedback looks like. Once you've kind of gone through that, it's time to actually put together the plan. So you create that plan. Now, you have a plan, you've done that basic research. So now it's time to execute. So when you go to execute, you take your plan and you get alignment and buy-in with your team and with the customers and with your stakeholders. So you're laying out this plan, saying what we're going to do, and you're aligning everybody to, okay, we're bought in, we buy this. Then you assign your team. So whose job is it to carry this out? Who's going to take this and go forward and be responsible for making sure that it does what it needs to do? At that point, you launch. As you launch, obviously, feedback starts to come in. And as you take in that feedback, you begin to adjust and adapt as necessary. So that's sort of an outline of one way in which to approach taking an idea and initiative all the way to actually maneuvering with it in action. So the main inhibitors to change and innovation, there are three. The first is a lack of resources. Okay, you have money and you have manpower as two essential resources to accomplish things in business. And a limitation of either of those, or if they're at capacity, means that the ability to innovate or change becomes very difficult. Second inhibitor is around team. The idea that you've looked at the skills necessary for your business to provide its product or service the way it's designed now, and now we need to innovate, change, and create something new. And you don't necessarily have the people who have the skills and abilities to do change. But then on the other side, once the change happens, that team may not have all the skills necessary to even adapt to that new reality. So the third inhibitor is fear. Okay, it's terror. It's that risk aversion piece where you know that there's a lot at stake. You know all the possible things that could go wrong, and you just can't move past that state of terror. Okay, so let's talk about teams. What I have drawn up here is a graph of DISC. DISC is a temperament assessment or a personality type assessment. Those of you who've taken Myers-Briggs, this is very similar. There's a lot of other assessments that also give you your personality type. But we're going to use DISC, number one, because I'm certified in it, and number two, because it's easy for me to show you very quickly. So here's how DISC works. These stand for dominance. So those folks whose personality type fits in that quadrant, they're very driven, okay? They like challenge. They're going to get things done. They're all about results. They never met a challenge that they couldn't handle. Things are going to happen under their leadership, okay? But these really can't be bothered with all the details and with all the analysis and all. They're impatient. They just want to get it done. They want to get there. They want to go. Okay. So you can see real quick, a D's problem is they're going to be driven to make a result and to have something happen. But what happens, they don't know till they get there. So this is a very inefficient and sometimes dangerous way to jump towards innovation. Now, I's are about the influencers. Okay. I stands for influence. They're all about, they're high energy. They like ideas. They like concepts. They like the relationship piece. They like that team. They like the energy that's generated by a new idea, and they're gonna motivate to get there. Okay, so you go, wow, that's great for momentum. Problem with the I's is the I's get bored easily. They don't like details, right? So they can start that, but as soon as their attention wanders and they're bored with it, or now we're into details that they don't like as much, and there's not a lot of energy happening because we actually have to do the work, they stop leading towards it, and they can distract the team, right? Okay, S's. S stands for steadiness, and the S's are all about the process. getting things done. They're the tortoise, not the hare. They're very steady. They're moving along. They keep going. Not a lot of change in their gears, but they're going to get it done. They're also super amiable. They're all about the morale of the team. Okay, here we all are together. We're getting along. We're accomplishing this together. We're all smiling. The problem with the S in this sort of scenario is that the moment that things get tough, or there's a little bit of friction, or any of that stuff that's going to happen with change and innovation, they start freaking out. They don't like that kind of friction. They don't like tension in the team. They don't even like change inherently. That stands for status quo. Okay? Now you got your C, conscientiousness. These folks are all about making sure it gets done right. They're the engineers of the pack, right? So they're sitting there and they're going to make sure that whatever we're innovating and putting together, it's going to work. They're going to be down in those details. They're going to make sure that this thing absolutely performs the way it should perform. Problem with the C is the C doesn't like to actually do anything till the plan has been perfected. And the problem with the C is there's never a moment when analysis isn't needed. So paralysis by analysis is common. So when we look at this, if you have a team that isn't balanced properly, it's very hard to get there because these things cover each other. Think about it. The D is driven, they're providing battery, they can take on challenges, they're not going to be stopped, they want a result, that's all great. But their lack of worrying about the people around them, their lack of the details and making sure it's going to work, just desire for a result. Well, guess what? That gets solved by the C, right? The C's like, okay, we are going to engineer this thing. We're going to make sure it does work. We're going to worry about those details. So yeah, we're going to get you the result, but we're going to do it on a path that makes sense and that can be handled, right? But oops, now I'm paralyzed because I got to keep analyzing. Well, the I is like, no, let's move. Let's energy, enthusiasm, momentum. Let's go. We're gonna move this thing along. We love that you got all those details, but let's stay on the idea. Let's stay shooting up there, right? But now, I'm getting a little bit bored. I don't really want to follow through with the process and all. Here comes our S's because they're steady. They're going to follow it. Okay, no, we've got a plan now. Let's move this along as we should. And by the way, we're all going to get along as we do it. So this lets you see that not that you have to necessarily match personality types, though it can be very helpful, but that you can assess your team on skills, on temperaments, on approach, on ability, on communication, on whatever it needs to be and say, look, we've got this covered, but we don't have this covered. And that's going to be our Achilles heel. So do we need to bring on some additional talent or skills that cover that, right? Or are we able to adapt ourselves, get coached, learn, adapt? What do we have to do to fill those slots that we identify as being the areas where we're going to fall down as we try to change or innovate? A lot of you came to look at what are those change inhibitors. What is it that will stop innovation from happening for you, your company, the organization that you're working with? And I hope we've sort of explained that a little bit. I hope we've shown you what are the things that stop innovation, how is innovation derived, what is required for innovation to be created. And be aware, you don't have to innovate on a level of Elon Musk, right? This is one of those things where within what you understand and know, can you push the boundaries a little? Can you take a little more risk? Can you go out and do a little bit more to generate some creativity, right? Can you take those steps? Because we've left 2020 and we all have high hopes that 2021 is going to be different. And the best way that we can maybe make that happen is to take some of these lessons, begin to implement them, and make the changes that we need to see for this to be a positive for us, as odd as that sounds, not a negative.